everyone. My name is Faith, and with me today we also have Abram Thiessen. Abram and I are social workers with the Manitoba FASD Center in Winnipeg, and we're going to talk a little bit today about talking to a child or youth about their FASD diagnosis. We are part of the Manitoba FASD Center, which is located at the SSCY Center in Winnipeg. And I also just wanted to highlight, if any of you watching are familiar with Sharon Wozni, she was a social worker with the FASD Center for many years. And so these slides that we're using today are adapted from a previous presentation of hers. So I'm just going to go over some of the things that we are going to discuss today and some of the topics that we're going to cover. Things like why having this conversation can be important. I know that talking to your child about their diagnosis of FASD can be a source of stress or anxiety for some parents. And that anxiety might sort of lead them to kind of avoid the conversation or maybe not choose to have that conversation at all. And that might be partially because of sort of their concerns about their child reaction or feel like maybe they're too young to understand. So we're going to sort of talk about all of that a little bit today. We're going to talk about why it can be hard to talk about and if there might be a best time. Who should talk to the child? Is there a best person? And what kind of wording should I use? How do I explain the alcohol information is a common question as well. And what do I do, or what happens if my child becomes upset? And we're also going to include, so most of the conversation today is going to be about talking with a child about their diagnosis after they've been already diagnosed with FASD. But we're also going to have a brief discussion on talking to your child or your teen about the assessment before it happens. So we're going to start by watching a brief, it's about 5 minutes or so video clip about Crystal Millian. And this video is, she's being interviewed by Jeff Noble, which is another sort of prominent figure in FASD, and talking about how she, learning more about her diagnosis helped her understand herself a little bit and some of the challenges that she had or some of the things that she struggled with. Once she learned more about her FASD diagnosis, she kind of felt like, oh, that makes sense. And it helped her sort of understand herself a little bit better. So we'll just watch about 5 minutes or so.
When you got diagnosed?
I was first diagnosed when I was around 11, and then I actually got retested just last year, just so I had good papers for university and stuff, because that was important. So
okay. When did you know you were different when you were younger? What was that like?
I didn't really notice in elementary school. Like, I mean, I had friends, I had good teachers. I actually, when I was really young, elementary, they almost skipped me a grade because like the schooling there was so-so. I noticed I was different more so, I think, middle school and high school because I was struggling so hard to like understand what was going on in the class. Math was a big issue, which I know is a big stereotype. Like, I think I was just passing math every year, and no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't understand what was going on, especially when it was like math, chem, anything really abstract. So we went and like I sat down with my aunt and uncle, and they told me that I had been tested, but I don't really remember it because I was so young and I didn't understand.
Right.
And that's when it all kind of started clicking, and I started looking at stuff online and like talking with them, and I started talking with a youth advocate. And that's when I noticed like, oh, it might be because of this. I might be forgetful because of this. And it all kind of hit me in a few years, I think.
Yeah. So when you say it hit you, like, how were you feeling before the diagnosis? Was it a relief to get it, or were you growing up thinking, why am I like this? Like,
I noticed I had more like issues than some kids. Like, I would get in fights with my parents and stuff like that over things like I would forget conversations. I would forget to do something. I wouldn't understand, like, if I did one thing wrong, the next thing is like the same thing as the first time. I always thought it was something different. So I'd get really frustrated, and I would struggle with emotions, especially because I am adopted. So I got introduced to a new sister in my life, and we had a lot of emotional problems because I think she was younger, so sometimes I would go to her level of emotion, or I'd get very frustrated with her. And I noticed other kids didn't do that, especially as I got older. Like, my levels of emotions and
Mm.
my thinking processes were a little bit slower. So I think a lot of it was frustrating until the diagnosis, and until I could like learn how to cope with the emotions and find ways to let out how I'm feeling and stuff like that. So a lot of emotional regulation, I think.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So
Yeah.
you would get like really ticked off really quickly?
Oh yeah. Me and my sister would get into fights over nothing. Like, she would just, I don't know, she'd take the front seat and I'd be like, why are you taking the front seat? I'm the oldest. And she was like, because I can, because, you know, she's got a personality on
Right,
her,
right,
right?
right, right.
And and I'd get so angry over that. And then 5 minutes later I'm okay, but I'll say something that I didn't mean, or I'll snap at her,
Yeah.
and she's still hurting, right? And like, I'm already over it. So it was really hard to like regulate that. Like, even probably now sometimes we bicker and whatever. I just like to think that it's sisters, not
Hmm.
just
Yeah, that happens. Yeah.
my own regulation, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've gotten a lot of issues.
So that's okay. So does everybody else. Okay.
Yeah.
So you said memory was one of them, right? That was and that's a primary characteristic. So that's
Yeah.
a common trait.
Mhm.
And you said you would forget conversations.
Yeah.
Would you ever hear them wrong?
Oh, yes. Yes. I would be like, no, you said this. And she's like, no, I
Mm,
said to put it over here. Like, we'd have conversations of like just moving stuff back and forth between the house and the garage. And I'd put it on the wrong end of the garage. And my aunt would be like, I just told you where to put it. I was like, I really thought you said the right side of the garage. She's like, no, I said the left. And like, just really simple things like
right.
that always slipped by me. It was always the simple things. And then it would just build up to like, well, why aren't I understanding this? And why aren't I getting it? Kind of thing. So.
Were you frustrated by that?
Oh yeah, like I didn't understand. Like, at first I thought maybe other families were this way, and then once I started building more friends in school and stuff, I realized I was the only one this way. And like, there was definitely a time period with all those frustrating conversations and stuff that I felt really isolated because I didn't understand like why I couldn't get it, right? Like, it was kind of a maturity thing too, because when you are told that you're one way as a kid, it's on your mind, right? And you're like, even though you're told you're acting because of, I think, a label or a disability, you're like, oh, but maybe it's just me, or maybe it's my fault. And so like, there was a long time there where it was just really frustrating. So,
Hmm.
mhm.
And then you get the diagnosis, and was that a relief?
I think so. Like, I definitely felt like when I sat down and talked about it some more, I definitely was like, okay, at least now I can reach out to resources and stuff that might be able to help. And I might be able to talk to teachers, and I can talk more openly with my family when I'm feeling a certain way, because they can be like, well, I read up on FASD and I think, and they can give their opinion.
Hmm.
So it was helping it get out in the open and feel less isolated.
So we chose this video because Crystal's story is one example of how helpful it can be for a child or a youth to have information about their diagnosis. For Crystal, it allowed her to understand why she was having a harder time learning than her friends and why she would become more emotionally dysregulated than her friends. It allowed her to reframe her thinking from I am the problem to I have a problem. Someone who thinks that they are the problem can negatively affect their self esteem and self concept and can lead to other issues like depression and other mental health issues. It's so much more helpful for someone to know that they learn differently and that there are solutions out there that can help them overcome some of the problems they might be having. Knowing about their diagnosis also helps allow for self advocacy. In the video, Crystal talks about how she became open to having a youth advocate who would help her meet with her teachers so that her work could be given to her with some different accommodations in place. She then describes how she eventually was able to become her own advocate later in high school. Finally, Crystal shares how she joined a social group where she met other teens with FASD, and that this experience led her to make new friends with shared lived experiences. So why is a diagnosis so hard to talk about? As parents, we are often upset at just thinking about any possible hardships our child may face or any negative experience they might have. So when a child is diagnosed with FASD, parents are often faced with intense feelings similar to those experienced when a loss occurs, such as fear, sadness, anger, denial, and then eventually acceptance. In addition to these feelings of grief, about their child having a diagnosis of a disability, the stigma specifically associated with FASD is also another factor that often makes it hard for parents to talk about their child or to talk to their child about their diagnosis. Very unfortunately and unfairly, many parents I've met share that they have strong feelings of shame and guilt around the alcohol use they had in pregnancy. In addition to judging themselves harshly, they also express feeling judged by others, and they are especially worried about how their child may react when told that they have an FASD diagnosis. For parents who choose to share their diagnosis with their child, and I believe most do choose to share this diagnosis, it's often a relief to them that their child's reaction is more accepting or even neutral than they expected it to be. We'll talk more about this in a future slide. The next few slides include some tips to keep in mind when talking with your child or youth about FASD. The first suggestion, resolve your own feelings first, is connected to the previous slide, since for many parents, there's this initial period of grieving that occurs when hearing that their child has a disability. So, as the social worker at the clinic, I'm often encouraging parents and caregivers to give themselves some time to process the diagnosis information on their own before talking to their child or youth. Children and youth will also mirror back the reactions and the feelings of others, so it's best to give information to children in a calm and straightforward manner. Children are less reactive to difficult information if the adults presenting that information do it in a matter-of-fact way. And ideally, when a parent talks to their child about their diagnosis, they will be able to do so in a way that leaves their child feeling good about themselves. It's best if a parent can convey feelings of hope and can present the information in an optimistic way, which will be difficult to do if a parent is still feeling really emotional and reactive about the diagnosis themselves. When thinking about sharing the diagnosis, a common question that caregivers ask is who should be the person to do it? Our recommendation is that the child learns about their disability from an adult that they have a positive relationship with and feel safe around. This is usually their parents or a CFS worker or their foster parents, but it could also be done by other supportive people in the child's life. Ideally, this person also has some basic knowledge about FASD as well, so that accurate information is provided to the child or the youth.
So a lot of what we're talking about today is talking with a child or youth after they have a diagnosis of FASD. But Abram and I also get a lot of questions from people who are coming in for their assessment, and how do they talk to their child about this assessment before it happens, maybe before they, we know if they have a diagnosis. And so if your child is younger, then it may be enough to just explain that they're coming for some appointments to see sort of how their brain works and how they learn best, and they're going to do some activities. And if they do end up receiving a diagnosis of FASD through the assessment, then a lot of the other information that we're talking about throughout this presentation is relevant in explaining the diagnosis to them sometime after the assessment and after you as the caregiver or the parent has had some time to process. Now, if the child is older, more adolescent or teenage years, we generally advise talking with them about the assessment before the assessment, because they may have some questions about it. And it's important that they're informed and consenting to what this is about, because this, the possibility of this diagnosis could impact their life. So you still may explain that the assessment involves coming to appointments to understand how their brain works and how they learn best. You can explain to them what FASD is and that it can happen when a baby is exposed to alcohol during the pregnancy. It is important to highlight that women do not drink when pregnant to intentionally cause harm. And we do want to do our very best to sort of preserve that relationship between the mom and the child and the youth when we can. If the circumstances of the mom's pregnancy are known, it may be appropriate to provide some context if the child is old enough to understand. Um, and you might want to explain that the assessment is intended to help better understand both their areas of strength and their areas of challenge. We do want to leave the opportunity to maybe let them process the information for a little while and come back to ask questions a little bit later. And just keeping in mind that if we're talking about this before the assessment has happened, we don't know at this point if they are going to be diagnosed with FASD or not. So just explaining that that's part of what this assessment is hoping to answer. Now, is there a best time to talk with a child or a youth about FASD or about their diagnosis? And the answer is every child's a bit different, really. There isn't a specific time or an age that's best to tell them. I know a lot of people sometimes think that they may be too young to understand, but even with young children, there can be sort of developmentally appropriate ways to talk about FASD, and it really just kind of starts the conversation for more ongoing discussion throughout their life. Abram alluded to this earlier, but once you as the parent or the caregiver has had some time to process your own feelings about the diagnosis, receiving an FASD diagnosis can mean some shock or be a bit emotional, and so you do want to give yourself time to process that on your own so that you can really be present for your child in talking with them about this diagnosis. And we talk about sometimes the need to be regulated as a parent in order to be present for our child's emotions that may come with this discussion. You may choose to sort of look for teachable moments, so times when a child says something about their difficulties or areas of challenge. If there's something that they often have some struggle with, or they're saying, like, why can I never remember things? Those little moments might be times to sort of cue parts of this conversation. I'd say like prior to adolescence if possible, but of course there is always exceptions to this. Um, we know that just, from a child development perspective, adolescents and teenagers are at a stage where they really just want to fit in and be like everybody else and not stand out. And so hearing at that stage something that can make them feel different might be a little bit harder. Now, we do certainly see lots of adolescents coming in for their assessment, and so at that point, that might have to be the time to have the conversation. And so some of the things that we talked about in the previous slides are some strategies to have that conversation maybe before the assessment. Just some tips on talking to them or sharing the information. We definitely want to talk about how everyone has their own strengths and challenges, because every child with or without FASD has a lot of strengths, and it's really important to highlight those and build on those. Make sure that they know that they're more like others than different. At the end of the day, all kids need, a lot of the same things in terms of love and nurturing and opportunities for play. They're more like any other child than they are different. You might choose to give some examples of people that they know who maybe have similar challenges or similar or other diagnoses. We want to communicate at a developmentally appropriate level, and that's not necessarily in accordance with sort of their chronological age level. We talk about sometimes children with FASD show or experience what we call dysmaturity. So, presenting or developing presenting a bit younger than what their chronological age is. So, just wanting to keep that in mind when we're talking with them about these things. You may choose to use the FASD assessment report as a roadmap to sort of discuss their challenges, what was learned through the assessment, what was harder for them, but also, of course, like we said before, what their strengths are. You may choose to use books or visuals. One sort of common feature with FASD is some challenges with processing verbal information. So sometimes using things that they can see or look at in picture books or visuals can be really effective. It's certainly not a one-time conversation, and I think that's an important piece as well. I give the example of a family that I used to work with who had a child who had been adopted when she was a baby, and I asked the family, does she know her adoption story or her adoption history? And they said, oh, yeah, we told her one time when she was 4. And so then I kind of thought, like, does she really know? If this was something that was shared one time at a really young age, does she remember that conversation? And similar with FASD, it's kind of an ongoing conversation throughout the child's life, and it's not certainly something that you need to, constantly be reminding a child that they have FASD or that they've been adopted or something like that. But those also don't have to be negative things. So it's just little moments to start the conversation and continue throughout the child's life. And again, you may need to give them some time to think about or process the information and then come back to talk about it or ask questions. And it may mean, repeating things again if there's pieces that they forget after some time, but they may need some time to process a little bit before they can kind of respond or ask some questions. Now, in terms of explaining the alcohol information, that is a common question. So often being like very matter of fact with children, they respond quite well. So things like FASD can occur if a fetus is exposed to alcohol, or FASD can occur if a baby was exposed to alcohol when the mom was pregnant with them. Yeah, like I was saying, kids often respond quite well to very simple, matter-of-fact information. If it's appropriate, depending on the child's age, we may want to provide some sort of definitely non-blaming explanations about why alcohol might be used in pregnancy. As I was saying before, it's definitely in the child's best interest to preserve a positive relationship with the mom, and we know that it wasn't to cause harm. So it may be appropriate to provide some context to that for their situation. I just wanted to give this example. This is from a children's book that's called FASD, sorry, Living and Learning with FASD, Jilly's story, that was put together by a group of students actually here in Winnipeg. And so this page sort of talks about the alcohol use, and it says FASD stands for fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. That means that before I was born, my mom drank alcohol. My mom didn't mean to hurt me. She just didn't know that the alcohol could cause damage to my brain while I was growing inside her. So again, just a very simple, child-friendly kind of explanation. And you may also want to share kind of additional reasons for learning or behavior difficulties. We know that it's not um, only related to the alcohol. We are all made up of lots of different experiences and genetics and just individual personality differences. So talking about how all of those things sort of play into who the child has become as well. And Abram's going to talk about some sort of common reactions of children and youth in learning about this information.
Yeah, so children and youth's reactions to being told that they have FASD, it really does differ from child to child. Some children or youth don't really seem all that interested and will return to whatever activity they were doing once they were given the information. And others are very accepting of being told this information, and it may feel like a sense of relief to them. They may have been wondering why they are not learning like their friends are at school, and now they have an explanation for that. If you remember in Crystal's video, this is how she said she felt when she learned about her FASD diagnosis. Similar to parents, it's also possible that a child will cycle through those feelings of grief we mentioned earlier and may also have complex feelings towards their parents. While some children's reactions pass quickly, others may have more intense reactions that last longer and can be more challenging to support. And so if your child's reaction is a little more than you expected or is a little challenging to support, what can we do to respond to that? And here are some suggestions uh, as to how to deal with your child if they do respond in a way in which they're upset. Um, Although parents sometimes fear this reaction, the suggestions that I'm going to give here are really similar to how a parent would typically respond to their child when they're upset about anything else in life. So the first is to validate their feelings and use strategies for calming your child that are typically effective in other situations. So just use a lot of those similar practices that you already do when your child is upset about other things. It's also really important to ask questions and listen to the child's reasons for being upset, because their concerns may be based on inaccurate information or assumptions about FASD. And so that's why, like we mentioned earlier, it's important that the person talking to the child or youth about FASD has some basic understanding and education on what FASD is, so that they're communicating accurate information to their child or youth. And then finally, we recommend to seek out support from an elder, counselor, or a trusted family member if you're concerned about your child's reactions. Now, here is one of the tools that we provide to families and schools after a child has been diagnosed with FASD. This is an example of what we call a rainbow sheet, which is basically an even shorter summary of the report that you receive when a child or youth is diagnosed with FASD. The ones that we use now don't look exactly like the one here on the slide, but they both show the same information. And these are documents that our follow-up team puts together for when we do debrief sessions with schools and caregivers. A really helpful thing that these documents do is that they break down each of the 10 brain domains that we assess to diagnose FASD, and they describe the strengths and challenges that the child or youth presented for each of those brain domains. We also provide caregivers with their own copies of these rainbow sheets to try to help them remember everything about their child's diagnosis. It can also be used to help explain a diagnosis to a child or youth because we try to keep the information on this rainbow sheet as easy to understand as possible.
And I just want to share another sort of possible tool, something that we call a "This Is Me" book that somebody working with a child can create with them. So it's just a book where they get to sort of personalize it and explain themselves, and they can use it kind of as a tool for, sharing about themselves with others or advocating with others. So they can talk if they choose to. They can talk a little bit about their diagnosis, and other aspects of themselves that sort of highlight that this diagnosis maybe doesn't define them. We want it to include things that they are good at, of course, like we talked about, always highlighting what their strengths and things that they like to do. This is a sample of one that sort of could talk about one of the individual brain domains, and some of the things that were learned throughout the assessment are kind of on the left-hand side. And then on the right is what this might look like for that child. And this is made sort of in conjunction with the child. So really highlighting sort of their experience. And that is everything. So thank you for joining us. If you do have questions about anything at all, or you want to connect with one of the social workers from the FASD Center, please don't hesitate to reach out. The phone number for the center is on this slide, and they can always connect you with one of us. So thanks for joining. Of FASD Center in the video.